Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 8, Javia of Fenvale. The first 10 day of frost flood was drawing to a close. The harsh late rime-song gales swept the inland sea regularly, bringing in their wake lingering high clouds that obscured the sunlight and left the ocean a pale green, awash with foamy white ripples. Rune stood on Karth's balcony, his eyes sweeping the far horizon. He appeared listless and dejected. Despite the apparent success of his mission to Arran, he found the role he was required to play there tedious and frustrating. As a captain in the Isles, he had always been the one to make the plan, to put forward a strategy and ensure the efficient execution of it. Now he was a mere thrall to be moved where his master would have him, without understanding the real reason for these moves. Perhaps it was simply that he would not make a good subordinate to anyone. Even this unequal, so-called partnership irked him. Karth made such strange demands, and would never compromise on them, as he did now about the boy. Rune turned to the silent man next to him. His mental fatigue was apparent in his voice.
"And why do I need him on this mission?"
Karth made light of it, as always. "He can handle a bow as well as many. Not that you ought to need such skills in Fenvale. I need him to find out something for me from their keeper of books, a task you would not perform to satisfaction, despite your admirable record as agent. That, of course, would be all the information the old man would be willing to divulge on the subject. Rune would need a different excuse. But what? Everything with which he could come up seemed contrived and childish.
"I am not going to play the bodyguard."
Karth was ready for this one. "You will have no need. I'm sparing you one of my precious Viran. Tyro will accompany you with instructions not to let the boy out of his sight." What could he say to that? He would not be forced to raise all the irrational objections mulling about inside him. The boy often made him uncomfortable, irritated him even, not by what he did or said, but by constantly reminding him of the life he had lost forever. It was like an open wound, touched and probed, till the agony of it became unbearable. But he would not admit this weakness to the man in front of him, and thus he was left no option but to grit his teeth and bear it. There were also times, after all, that he enjoyed the boy's company, times when he forgot who the child was. Karth saw that he had gained the victory once more. Was there a little note of triumph in his tone? "Millen will go as well. Gareth tells me you need someone to keep your things together." Rune shook his head.
"The little rat. He will regret it."
Taking advantage of a lull between storms, Rune and his 3 companions departed for the Fever Coast the next day. The rocky, dangerous coast of Fenvale made landing there a risky endeavor, and the troubled Ligurian realm would best be avoided also. The party would make its way northwards through the swamps and valleys of the Vadran kingdom to Shirvan, the secluded capital of an inaccessible realm. They would be met by a guide shortly after landing, without whom their journey northward would be fraught with danger and probably take twice as long. The ship was Karth's best, captained by the very man who had fished Rune out of the cauldron 7 seasons before. There were smiles and a feeling of goodwill on the ship, partly caused by their shared experience, partly by the presence of Gareth's supposed bodyguard. Tyro had perhaps 40 cycles, a tremendous sense of humor, and no regard for rank or position. At first glance, one might even find him brazen and disrespectful, but his hearty manner soon won over the disdainful or the proud. For all his harmless pleasantries and familiar remarks, Tyro had one annoying habit, one that irritated Rune at least. He believed himself gifted with wisdom, and had a peculiar way of dispensing it. Certainly, there was a slight degree of truth to his unvoiced claim, for he had a way of regarding a matter that most people would not have considered at all, and often his opinions gave self-assured listeners the pause. It was only that he half expected those favored by his singular insights to be in the know before he had actually made those thoughts plain. He would make a remark, obscure and almost meaningless by itself, and follow it with a question, dangling it in the air, till the other party had to beg the answer. Rune had no time for such verbal games, and avoided speaking to the man in a casual way as much as possible. 3 days of running before the wind took them well past the cauldron, and swiftly skirting the southernmost outposts of Track's Isles. A pale sun kept them company, softening the harshness of the cold northwesterly breeze. Rune had had enough of the cabin chatter and idle gambling of the off-duty crew members below decks. He kept to himself from the start of the morning watch, and sat with furrowed brow in a corner. Inevitably, the brooding thoughts marched their dismal course through his mind, till he sat wringing his hands impatiently, awaiting the moment when decisive action would occupy the painful idle time he was now forced to endure. Suddenly, the walls of the cabin seemed too confined a space for his contemplations. He grabbed his coat from a hook, pulled it on, and climbed up through the hatch. The strong rush of air was a welcome sensation. He turned to look about him. Leaning against the portside bulwark, mantle streaming in the strong breeze, stood a small figure. Rune stole up behind him, though the sound of his approach would certainly be drowned out by the roar of the wind through the rigging. He stood a moment behind the boy, watching as the spray leaped up almost to touch his hands where they gripped the side, while the ship labored through the heavy swell. As he spoke, there was a sudden lull, so that his voice came out louder than he had intended.
And for what reason does Fengor's son stand staring in the high wind?
The blond head looked round, eyes wide and overbright. The startled expression quickly dissolved into a slightly pained look. Rune stepped up to the rail and looked out over the foamy crescents of the green sea. He fastened his grip on it as the ship rolled into a gully. Next to him, Gareth's voice strained above the wind.
I like the wild sea. It's strong and free, and does what it wants without begging leave.
He turned away his head.
And the fierce wind, it blows away the darkest of your thoughts.
Rune made no reply, but turned his face into the buffeting breeze, enjoying the deafening rush of air past his ears. If only it were that simple, he thought, as the airy fingers pulled at his hair. But his darkness was too well fortified for the wind to reach. There was a sudden tug on his sleeve, and he turned his face down to the boy. The wind was blowing back Gareth's hair, and his blue eyes were wide and serious. At once the sight dragged at Rune's memory, as if he had lived through the moment before. The boy spoke as softly as the wind would allow.
If you will forget that I was Fingor's son, I will forget that you were his brother.
Rune stared at him. He had not missed the subtle emphases. It had not occurred to him before that the boy might find his presence as disturbing as he did the boy's. For a while he just looked at him. Then he gave a small nod and turned back to his staring over the sea. The storm caught up with them as they sighted land. Rain swept in from the west, drenching the ship in an instant. The captain was most anxious to be off and free of the shallow reefs of the area. There was no time to linger and wait for a fair day. The boat was lowered for them at once. 2 oarsmen from the ship were bundled into it with them. Millen and Gareth were set the task of bailing, which they performed all the way to the shore. They landed in a tiny cove paved with pebbles instead of sand. It mattered not that they had to wade through the water waist-deep before reaching land. They were wet through already. One behind the other, they made their way along the shore towards a copse of trees in the distance. The rocky terrain was littered with scraggly shrubs and low grass, glistening and slippery in the wet. Once they had entered the trees and worked their way to the leeward side of an outcrop, the wind abated considerably. Still, they were a wet and miserable little group settling in for an uncomfortable night. Thyro soon had a fire going in a sheltered spot, having wrapped the flint in an oiled cloth, and they huddled gratefully about the blaze. Quickly they constructed a dripping stick shelter, draped a large quantity of fragrant shrubs torn from the shallow soil over it, and moved in out of the rain. Darkness was settling over the land. Gareth looked disdainfully at his drenched pack. He pulled out the wet blanket and grimaced.
I don't think I have anything dry.
There were sniggers from the others in reply. He looked at them reproachfully, but their equipment was in no better state than his. Thyro pulled off his boots and poured some water out of them. He put them lengthways in front of the fire and stretched himself out on his wet blanket, placing his feet on top of the boots. A sigh of satisfaction escaped him.
Ah, that's better.
Rune and Gareth soon followed his example, while Millen set a small pot over the fire and filled it with water. The youth seemed more at ease than he had been for several 10 days after his return from the dank wood. He shook himself like a dog before settling down with the others.
This horrible weather. One could catch your death of a chill outside on a night like this.
Gareth chuckled.
Is that why they call it the fever coast?
There was laughter all round. Rune remarked,
Only Millen need to be concerned with that. Viron are most resistant to fevers and agues, like we are to most poisons and drugs.
Gareth looked at him skeptically.
I had a severe fever in the tent after Everin found me.
Rune nodded.
That was brought on by fatigue, a natural reaction from your body. What I'm talking about is the wasting sickness or black plague, to which the marsh dwellers succumb every cycle when the rainy season starts. It moves as far north as Ligurium, claiming many lives, but I've yet to hear of a Viron who died from it.
Thyro spoke up.
Believe me, we are not resistant to the cold. You can certainly die from that.
He reached forward and placed another stick on the fire. Rune and his party lingered in their shelter till mid-morning, awaiting the guide they had been promised. How he would locate them on this forsaken coast they had no idea. Each one took the opportunity to air and dry his clothing, though the rain still came down in torrents, and they would undoubtedly have to brave it again ere long. The Vadran stood among them suddenly, holding his nose.
I could smell your fire all the way from the trustwood.
He looked about him accusingly, his weathered face a testimony to the hardships of constant exposure to the elements.
Where is the prince?
Rune and Gareth caught each other's eye. Rune stepped forward. The small man reached out a hand to him.
Prince Rune, I have heard of you, and not all of it was bad. My name is Air, like you breathe, only it's written different. And no, I have not inherited anything yet, so don't ask. I will guide you to Shervin.
Rune took the proffered hand and said,
I'm grateful for it.
Air waved his free arm dismissively and removed his wet cloak. He stepped closer to the fire and addressed Thyro.
Make a little room there, big man. This blow will soon be over. We'll get underway when it's a little easier going.
Once he was seated and had spread the garment over his knees, he proceeded to stare at Gareth with undisguised curiosity.
And who's the little fellow?
He demanded. Rune was sorely tempted to reply that the Vadran should speak for himself. but thought it foolish to annoy a man they would have to depend on over the next few days. Instead, he signaled to Gareth to hold his tongue. He would do the introducing.
That is Gareth, on Lord Carth's business.
He pointed to Millen.
Our cook, Millen, and the big man next to you is Tyro, brought along to swat the stinging flies.
Eyre looked at each in turn. Then he said earnestly to Tyro,
I hope we don't find too many of those.
The rain stopped by late afternoon. The wind was not as strong as before, but still gusty and cold, causing the water-laden branches under which they passed to strafe them with droplets from time to time. The sky was a dark grey canopy, threatening another deluge at any moment. They pressed on far into the night, with Millen holding to the back of Tyro's cloak not to stumble in the dark. The Vadran guide seemed as comfortable in the darkness as the Viron. Shortly before dawn, they halted to get some sleep. They were on the edge of the fens, and it would be risky to find their way through without the aid of daylight. There were breaks in the heavy cloud now, and watches were organized based on the position of Lauren's eyes and the early morning sun. Since there were 5 of them, each one needed only keep watch for an hour. Gareth was appointed as the first, and the others rolled into their damp blankets. Though he was sleepy as could be, the cold kept the boy awake. They had not started a fire, the campsite being unsheltered and easy to spot from afar. Eyre was peculiarly apprehensive, and had insisted on absolute silence while they walked. The others regarded him nervously, sensing the possibility of a dangerous encounter merely by witnessing his wary approach. The marshland of Fenvale that awaited them later that day was very different to that of Tirallen. Thickly wooded hillocks rose out of the bogs, sometimes joining arms in sweeps of broad-leaved forest or rocky ridges, blocking off the view. It was a maze lined with lethal traps for the careless traveler, a place where patience and caution were called for. To the east, tall mountains marked the borders of Tirallen, forbidding peaks, uninhabited and unexplored. They turned their backs on the sea now, and traveled northeastwards. Once more they moved in single file, stepping in the footprints of their guide, looking about them with wary interest. There was no pathway to speak of. People had no need to travel this way. It was only the instincts and experience of the small Vadran that could bring them safely through the labyrinth. A deep gully opened up to the east, and they turned into it, twisting and turning among the foothills of the Fanghill Mountains. The rocky slopes were pock-marked in places with hollows and overhangs. Eyre kept glancing up at these in a nervous manner, till Rune asked him if he expected an ambush in this forsaken place. Instead of replying, the man suddenly squatted down and motioned to the others to do the same. He placed a hand above his eyes, staring for a long time at the rock faces to the right of their passage. Rune fingered the hilt of his blade. The nervousness of their guide had rubbed off on him. Something sinister lurked in these hollows, a wild threat that would prey opportunistically on any passer-by. Eyre moved quickly now, though the terrain was difficult still. At the first opening in the ridge to their left, he worked his way westwards out of the gully and into a stretch of marsh. It was preferable to struggle through the bog than to keep too close to the unknown threat among the cliffs. There were pools of clear water now, deep and long, with white stones and sand lining their bottoms. 4 miles distant, a smallish mountain rose out of the marshland, solitary and defiant, at odds with its surroundings. It seemed to have separated itself from the Fanghills and struck out for the ocean on its own. Turning round to the rest, the guide pointed excitedly at this tree-covered hill.
We are heading for that.
The next moment, his eyes grew large with fear.
Argoth's wrath! Run for it!
Without waiting to see their reaction to this sudden panic, he sped off towards the rocky island he had indicated a moment before. Already, he stumbled and splashed through shallow puddles as he missed the safest route one would discover only with careful exploration. Rune whipped round to assess the threat. His blade was in his hand, gleaming in the dull light. The others had halted also, whirling about to discover what had scared the little man so badly. At first they could not make out a thing. Perhaps he was fooling with them and would turn soon to laugh at their wide-eyed alarm.
What is that?
Millen shouted the question, fear making his voice tremble. Rune shaded his eyes against the brightness, though the sun had again sunk into a bank of heavy cloud. Something like smoke was pouring from the gully they had left earlier that day, milling about as if searching for a direction in which to travel. He turned back to the fast receding figure of their guide. As loudly as he could, he shouted after him, "What is this?" Air did not even turn his head, but they could discern his answer clearly.
Rah! Demon bats! For the sake of all gods in all places, get going!
Rune turned to take one last look. He had never heard of Ra before. The column of smoke billowed in swirling turmoil above the peaks. There had to be hundreds, no thousands of bats in it. He had barely registered this fact when the column seemed to bulge in their direction, flattening out in a sudden lurch of purpose. Away they sped after the retreating guide, their eyes on the tricky terrain, regretting now the moments lost through ignorant curiosity. The men with their longer legs soon gained on the fleeing Vadran, but Gareth found himself falling behind. He drew the hood of his cloak over his head and loosed the dagger in its sheath. There was no way the group could cover 4 miles to shelter before the pursuing horde caught up with them. Tyro turned back when he could no longer hear the footfalls behind him. Gareth was perhaps 50 yards behind, hurrying towards him. A gray, spiraling mass moved across the open land, almost at his heels. Soon he would be engulfed by it. The Viran cursed and drew his blade. Calling to the others, he rushed back to the boy's aid. Air yelled at the top of his voice.
The water! Get in the water!
He appeared quite hysterical. Gareth saw the men stop. Tyro's eyes were large with shock. For a moment he looked afraid. The blade flashed blue in his hand as he composed it without thinking. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. Someone else was shouting about water. Then a thing struck the boy from behind and dropped him to his knees. A horrible, high-pitched scream rose from all around. The din was terrific, disorientating him, till all he could do was to cover his face instinctively with his hands and roll himself into a ball. The whir of thousands of wings passed over his huddled body, fangs ripped at his cloak in passing. Tyro struck with his blade, cleaving a bat in half. His left arm he kept in front of his face, protecting his eyes. The swarm split where he stood, whirling away behind him. A blood-crazed fiend hit him in the chest, so hard it winded him. He crushed it under his boot and ducked to avoid the next one. Someone charged past him, against the tide. Rune had his cloak wrapped round his left arm, using it as a shield. His blade scythed about him in bright circles, slicing anything that came within his reach. Sometimes 2 creatures tumbled from the air at once, missing wings or cloven in twain. Gareth felt a strong hand grasp his collar and lift him from the ground. He stumbled along for a few steps, and then fell forward, headlong into the cold embrace of the marsh water. There was an arm around his chest, holding him down. He fought to be free of it, and rose to the surface spluttering. Rune's voice spoke in his ear.
Take a deep breath.
He hardly had time to obey before he was dragged under again. There was a burning pain in his left hand, and it felt as if someone had scraped the skin off his back. Black wingtips touched the surface of the water where they lay. Tyro's body splashed into the water right next to them, making his heart skip a beat. Rune was struggling with something behind him. 2 more bodies hit the water. The arm round Gareth's chest disappeared, and then he was pushed to the surface. His head bumped into Rune's back. He turned his face sideways to catch a breath. Rune was breathing heavily next to him.
Take off your pack and hold it up as a shield. Keep your face above water beneath it.
Once he had managed to do as he was told, their packs made a convenient shelter, with gaps too small for the Ra to penetrate. 1 or 2 of the horrible creatures settled on top, screaming and clawing the leather. Soon the other men followed Rune's example, joining them inside a little fortress under ferocious assault. The battered little group looked at each other in disdain. Rune spoke all their thoughts.
We can't stay here like this.
Air now seemed the least perturbed of them all. All traces of panic had disappeared from his voice.
They will soon tire and leave us. Then we'll make for the next waterhole. If we can make it to the mountain before dark, we'll be fine.
Mullen shivered. The water was cold.
Before the dark.
He retrieved leather thongs from his pack to tie the frames together.
Yes, they are more vicious at night. It's their feeding time.
Gareth suddenly squirmed in Rune's grip, moaning through his gritted teeth. The latter released the boy and turned him round to see his face.
What is it? Did they hurt you?
Gareth was obviously distressed, but he tried to make light of it.
A bit on my back and here.
He held up his hand.
It stings.
He squirmed again. Air turned to him.
Yes, it's a good thing you had that pack on, or we would see your ribs right now. Keep it under water and wash it out as much as you can. It will prevent the swelling later. I have something for it when we get to a safe place again.
Tyro moved closer. There was a deep gash below his right eye.
Hurts like a dozen bee stings, eh?
He helped Gareth to remove his cloak.
I'm sorry. I should have stayed closer to you.
The boy noticed the mark on his face.
You're hurt.
Air pulled on the man's arm.
Look at me.
He whistled through his teeth.
Aye, that's how they do it. By Horan's put-down soul. They take out the eyes first, and then the helpless creature is torn to shreds trying to stumble to safety.
He grinned mischievously.
I thought you were the fly swatter.
Tyro smiled ruefully while wiping the blood from his right cheek.
They were a bit larger than your average stinging fly.
Get some water on that.
Air said, his grin fading. Gareth had struggled out of his shirt. He flinched violently every time Rune's fingers touched the burning gashes down his sides. The man offered him the leather strap of one of the packs.
Here, bite on this. Then you won't have to break your teeth. But remain still or we'll be at this all day.
The boy looked at him reproachfully, but did as he was told. A spatter of raindrops moved over their shelter. Soon there was another, and before long a steady fall swept over their hiding place. Air smiled and nodded to himself.
This is good. The rain will wear out their patience quicker than anything, except maybe a bright hot sun.
He looked around at the others.
When you pass through here, you wish for a bright day. That will sometimes keep them inside.
Or a rainstorm.
Rune remarked dryly. He was growing numb in the cold water and impatient.
I'm having a look.
I'm with you.
Air said.
If they are not in sight, they have given up for the moment. There is nowhere for them to hide for miles.
The group moved at a trot, partly to warm their chilled bodies, partly to reach the promised safe place as soon as possible. The rain was sifting down in wave upon wave, obscuring their view of the landscape. Though it boded well for their escape from the Raw, they might have moved right past the mountain without noticing it, had it not been for their guide. The Vadran kept them going through the grey curtain, till the tall trees they had seen from afar surrounded them. The ground sloped upwards, but was firm and covered in leaves and litter from the small forest. At last he halted in front of a sizable hollow on the side of the cliff. Gratefully, the party lined up to inspect their shelter. Packs were lowered to the ground, then dragged in out of the rain. Without being told, they started looking about them for firewood. The day had been a long one for the amount of rest they had had the previous night. It seemed like they were in for another wet, uncomfortable night. Although the overhang afforded some cover against the driving rain, Tyro and Millen were having little success in starting a fire. The logs were rather rotten and wet, the kindling no better. The sky was still a grey blanket, but the brightness of the hidden sun was beginning to fade. They would be in darkness all too soon. Rune turned his back to the struggling men, placed one foot on the moss-covered grey rock hedging the shelter, and peered into the distance. He was not too sure they were beyond the reach of the Raw in this place. Despite Air's assurances, he still felt uneasy. Gareth arrived with an armful of firewood. He appeared wet through, and his hair was plastered to his head. He seemed cheerful enough, in stark contrast to the men, and flashed Rune a quick smile. The man raised an eyebrow.
How are those scratches of yours?
Not so bad now.
Tyro was swearing at the wet flint. He flung them down in despair and leaned back looking miserable and defeated.
What a day! First we have all the fiends from the pit after us, and now I have to sit here and freeze my backside off.
He turned his back upside down, pawing the soaked contents with disgust.
What are we going to eat?
Gareth turned to stare at the wet logs and scattered plant debris Tyro tried to use as tinder. He remembered Karth's room and the simplicity of drawing fire from the air itself. Would that work here? Why would it be different? He jumped down to where they sat staring at the heap of wood. They did not look at him. He closed his eyes, feeling for the spark. It was so easy to find now that he knew it was there. With a laugh, Gareth drew the fire out of the wet air, setting the rotten, soggy logs ablaze instantly. He grinned impishly at the men. A tiny rivulet of rainwater ran from his soaked hair, between his eyebrows and down his nose, to drip onto his waterlogged cloak. Rune pulled back in alarm. He had caught his breath audibly, and now stared wide-eyed at the boy.
Wizard spawn.
He whispered under his breath. An image of a smiling Karth appeared before his mind's eye. Tyro and Millen merely smiled in return, and stepped up to the blaze, removing their cloaks and holding them out to the heat. Steam rose in little clouds from the sodden garments.
Thanks, boy. I knew you'd be useful for something.
Tyro sounded quite pleased at this unexpected outcome. Air reacted quite differently. He stared at the boy with large round eyes, and spoke a little excitedly.
Why didn't you do that earlier? Those pestilent parasites fear fire above all things.
Gareth shrugged.
I can't just do it like that.
He snapped his fingers. Air raised his eyebrows half an inch.
You just did it, like that.
His finger snap was considerably louder than the boy's.
No, things have to be right, and the fuel, and the air.
His voice trailed off. It was impossible to explain. The Vadran still looked mightily impressed.
There are those among us who practice the art, boy, and they would all sorely like to play a trick like that. Better keep it under your hat if you do not want too much attention on you in Shervin. I, for one, will be mighty careful what I say to do in the future.
When Millen turned away to tend to his bag, Tyro leaned in close to whisper.
You could set a person alight like that.
Gareth looked at him horror-struck.
No, I don't believe it can be done. The firewood has little purpose other than to burn. It sort of invites you, but a person would resist most fiercely. It wouldn't work, not even with an animal, I don't think.
They kept the fire burning high all night. A line was stretched in front of it, over which they spread their clothing and blankets, while the packs lay steaming a yard away from the blaze. Millen managed to salvage some of the dry rations, and concocted a meal out of what had been spoiled. They sat close to the fire eating it, while the rainwater swept past their shelter and rivulets, and the wet garments sent hissing droplets into the fire whenever the wind stirred through them. Gareth's cloak was ruined, hanging in tatters from the line, and the back of his shirt was badly torn. Rune looked at the angry red gashes on his body, and decided he had been brave back in the pool to have them handled so roughly. Air was thinking along the same lines. He produced a small gourd of ointment, unstopped it, and dragged 2 fingers through an ochre, sticky pulp inside it. After tossing the gourd to Rune, he motioned to Tyro to lean closer. The man's cheek was swollen considerably by now, so that he had trouble seeing properly out of his right eye. Gareth seated himself in front of Rune and took hold of his knees. He placed a piece of bark between his teeth. Rune sniffed at the gourd. The ointment had little odor. Probably just some sheep fat doctored with a local herb. He tried to be as gentle as possible, but the boy still flinched heavily at his touch. He shot a remark in Air's direction.
Wonderful place, Fenvale. Never realized just how hospitable it is.
Air snorted loudly.
It is only recently that this sort of thing happens with any regularity. 2-3 cycles ago, it was a very rare occurrence. And of course, you know what that means.
Tyro let out a yelp of pain as the Vadran pressed a little too hard. Air did not wait for a response from Rune.
For you Viran up north, the swarm has become a legend. A story you do not quite believe anymore. But we live closer to the source. We know what it means. That's why much of our farmland has been flooded. What you do not know about this legend is that the creatures not only spawn in the desert, but much further north, in the marshes and low-lying woodlands. They crawl out of caverns in the Fenvale mountains, on the very borders of Doyle, and we burn them out with pitch, or drown them with the waters of the inland sea. Once they get among the livestock, there will be no stopping them. The wings will drop, the body quadruple in size, the fangs and claws grow long and vicious, and no longer will they consume anything but flesh.
Mullen spoke out of a dark corner. They jumped, having partially forgotten that he was there.
But these creatures are small compared to what I have heard.
Air looked at him indignantly.
Wait till the change comes, till they take on their real shape. Some of them grow as tall as a man. And no, not a Vadran man, a good lanky islander.
He looked at each one in turn, pointing with his greasy finger.
The trouble comes when these vicious little flyers get more prey than they can handle. When all of them change at once, you have yourself a swarm.
The morning was still gray with a light drizzle. At least their gear and clothing were dry again, and the packs would keep them that way unless they were forced to take another swim. They were less than a day's march from Doyle, where more supplies could be procured, or perhaps a wagon ride all the way to Sherman. Their guide, however, would not hear of it. Eyre simply made a face when they suggested heading in the direction of town. He addressed Rune in serious tones.
We will skirt round Doyle. It is not a safe place for the likes of you and your party at the moment.
Malik has agents there.
Eyre spat on the ground.
It is even worse in Chendis to the east. Merchants from Terralan. They foul the place. But short of closing the border, it is impossible to keep them out. And the offal that they bring with them causes such trouble that hardly a Vadran in that town is safe in his own house. If you ask me, he is looking for an excuse to invade, though his type hardly needs that.
The little man rubbed his hands together.
But let him come. We may have a few surprises for him.
They set out again for the deepest parts of the fens, where men could lose themselves forever, following after lights in the fog, slipping into the clinging soil, never to be seen again. Eyre assured them that there was plenty to eat if one knew where to look, and they would have ample opportunity to restock their dwindling food supply. At the rate they were traveling, it would take only 2.5 days to reach the capital. If needs be, they could live on roots for that time. Only Tyro grumbled at this prospect, the others smiling behind his back. That evening they were met by another Vadran. He spoke in low tones with their guide, and departed soon after without greeting any of the party. Eyre was frowning when he rejoined them at the fireside. He brought something with him the man had shoved into his hands before leaving. It was an Eyre bow, but shorter than the Nurian variety, and not as stout. He placed a large bundle of arrows on the ground next to Rune, and proceeded to string the bow. Rune picked up the arrows and pretended to examine them.
What was that about?
Eyre replied without looking at him.
A man from Doyle. He was sent out to make sure we did not enter the town. Too many strangers about.
The bow was strung and ready. Rune held out a hand.
Let me see it.
It was a well-made weapon, with excellent balance and a trim, smooth feel.
It is made of air wood.
The small man's reply was vehement and harsh.
Yes, Eyre, with his bow of air. It's nothing but the air. Go ahead and snicker. I've heard them all since I was tall enough to step in cow dung.
Rune was taken aback at the unexpected outburst, but managed to keep his smile in check.
Judging by the way you can string it, I would wager you hit anything but air.
He turned to Gareth. An idea had occurred to him, something he had read in Karth's letter to Byrand.
Can you bend this?
The boy looked at him a little scandalized.
I can bend a proper bow.
He looked down as he realized the Vadran's eyes were fixed on him. Taking the bow from Rune, he got up to make a show of it. To his surprise, it was not necessary to pretend delight. The weapon was superb, and so much more suitable than Bjor's powerful affair.
This is a good bow.
He turned to Eyre.
Where can I get one?
Rune smiled to himself. If Gilreth was to train boys for war, Byrand would appreciate bows like this one. Perhaps an arrangement could be made once he saw the Vadran king in Shirvan. As soon as the hand touched him, Rune had the man's arm in a vice-like grip. He released it when he saw it belonged to Air, but not before the latter had made an ugly face at him.
There.
Air's voice was just a breath. Rune saw figures scurrying from one patch of deep shade to another, 50 yards away from their campsite. He could clearly make out the bone ornament dangling from the man's pierced ear, not to mention the telltale glint of starlight on the naked steel of the dirk in his hand. It was the Marshlander, that was for certain. Without shifting his position or raising up, he placed a hand over Tyro's mouth and prodded him awake with his foot. The big man turned sleepy eyes on him. Rune warned him with a finger on his lips and rolled out of his blanket. Air had already woken the others. Silently, they drew their weapons. The packs and blankets were left in place round the fire. As they retreated into the trees, Rune whispered to Gareth,
Stay close to me.
The Vaedran, armed with his bow and keen night sight, slipped away from them to find a position higher up on a knoll overlooking the camp. Rune crouched down close to the site, his eyes fixed on the trees where the figure had disappeared. For a while, all was quiet. Lauren's eyes peered at them from almost directly overhead. Gareth tested the point of his dagger on his thumb, dreading the moment he would have to use it. He shivered with the cold, not having had sufficient opportunity to locate and pull on his doublet over his nightshirt. He bent down to fasten the straps on his boots properly. Rune's hand gripped his head tightly and turned it slightly to the left. 2 figures were creeping into their camp, slithering along the ground. Rune crouched down, readying himself to pounce on them. Next to him, Tyro and Millen did the same. Gareth, who was already on one knee, had no intention of pouncing on anything, but when the others rushed forward, he would have to rush with them. The figures reached the first of their blankets. Obviously disappointed, one raised his head slightly to peer at the other huddled shapes. Rune leaped away, leaving the others 5 paces behind. The assassins scrambled to their feet to meet the onslaught. The leading man met Rune's initial blows with some skill. These were not mindless thugs. Tyro engaged the second man, with Millen just behind him waiting for an opening. Gareth hung back in the trees, feeling oddly apprehensive. Why were there only 2 attackers? If they had known where to find the group, they probably knew who was in it. 6 or 7 bowstrings sang from close by. Gareth turned his head to see the steel blade of a black-clad figure sweeping down on him. He crouched and heard the splintering of wood as it dug into the tree trunk above his head. The man was close enough to touch. He thrust the dagger into an exposed thigh with all his strength and heard a hiss of pain. Yells erupted all around. Gareth fled towards the others, calling out as he went,
Archers in the trees!
Millen retrieved his sword from the attacker he had stabbed and slid behind a pack for cover. Tyro bellowed like a charging bull and set off past Gareth to get to close quarters with this new threat. Rune shoved his blade through the Marshlander's throat, but staggered almost immediately under the impact of a shaft that lodged itself in his left shoulder from behind, to burn there like a red-hot coal of fire. Nevertheless, he was only a pace behind Tyro, allowing the hidden assailants no time for a second shot. The archers, so quickly robbed of their advantage, put up a poor fight. 3 were struck down within moments, and the remaining 4 turned to flee. Tyro brought one down with a mighty blow, severing the head completely. Rune accounted for 2 more in quick succession, gasping with a searing pain in his back. Millen was not quick enough to stop the last man. Rune reached back to remove the arrow, but could not get hold of it.
Get him!
He hissed at Tyro, but there was no need. An arrow out of the dark skewered the fleeing bandit. He fell with a cry and lay still. The triumphant defenders regrouped round their fire. Tyro turned Rune round and whistled when he saw the arrow. He spoke over his shoulder to their guide.
Should we not move the camp?
Air shook his head vehemently.
I took the last one as he tried to hobble away. We're safe for the moment.
Get some more light then. Rune's hit.
Millen ran to put more wood in the flames. The others crowded round as Rune knelt next to the fire. He grimaced with the pain, suffering through their rough examination.
It's high, not too dangerous.
Air pointed at the arrow.
These have wicked little barbs. You can't pull it out.
Push it through. Then you cut off the head.
No, it's too close to the lungs.
Tyro touched the shaft, putting a little pressure on it. Perhaps it was loose enough. Rune swore loudly.
Get away from me, you butchers!
He sat up and reached over his shoulder, but the arrow hovered just beyond his grasping fingers. He sank back onto hands and knees, uttering more obscenities. Blood was trickling down his left arm, running between the fingers of his hand. He sighed painfully. Air stepped closer.
I'll cut it out for you.
Rune waited, clenching his teeth. The Vadran leaned over him, prodding the area around the protruding arrow. Rune flinched and hissed at him.
What is it? Are you enjoying this carrion crow?
Air pulled back a little in annoyance. Then he gripped the shirt where it had been pierced and ripped it away. Rune howled as the arrowhead scraped against his shoulder bone.
I can't see where to cut. The shirt has to come off.
Air said apologetically. Rune stared at him malevolently.
Then cut it, damn you! Don't rip it!
The Vadran shrugged.
It is stronger than I thought.
Rune, worn out, snapped at him.
Then don't think.
Air rose to his feet.
You can do it better.
Tyro sidled up to Gareth.
Go talk to him. Distract him. And when he's not looking, I will yank it out.
The boy did not think it much of a plan, but went to kneel next to the bleeding man. Rune looked at him with the eyes of a wounded animal, but he did not flinch when Gareth put his hand gently on the hurt shoulder. Absurdly, there was something about the man at that moment that reminded him of Riot. He took out the dagger and proceeded to slice through the shirt down to its hem, speaking soothingly all the time.
I think perhaps this time they were after you.
Rune made a sound of acknowledgement, waiting for the clumsy mistake and the torturing stab of pain. Gareth pulled the remainder of the shirt over the man's head, dropping it around his wrists. The sight of the wound nearly made him gasp. The jagged arrowhead had opened a deep cut, oozing blood at the slightest movement. The shaft protruded from the shoulder blade like a broken bone. The boy had to look away quickly. The rest of Rune's back, from his hip to the nape of his neck, was a battlefield of scar-riddled skin. Gareth gaped at him.
What are all these marks?
Rune actually laughed, causing a fresh issue of blood.
Reminders of why I'm still alive.
They do not trouble you?
I have enough aches and pains to last me the rest of my short, unhappy life. But at the moment, what troubles me most is that twig stuck in my back, and your never-ending jabbering.
Tyro was in position. He nodded at the boy, but Gareth shook his head. He would not risk the fragile trust between him and the kneeling man, and therefore would not become party to this small betrayal. He reached behind him and placed the blade of the dagger in the fire. Tyro made big eyes at him and retreated. Melon poured water into their pot and placed that on the fire too. Then he proceeded to tear Rune's ripped shirt into ribbons. Gareth retrieved the blade and dunked it in the water to cool down. He unbuckled his belt and gave it to Rune.
So you don't have to break your teeth.
The man grimaced and bit down on the leather. He appeared calm, at least more so than a few moments before. There was a light touch as the boy's fingers gripped his shoulder. Gareth leaned forward to speak close to his ear.
I'm going to dig it out. First I'm going to make a little cut at the top, and then one at the bottom. Then I'm going to have to stick it in there to catch the barb.
It sounded simple even to him, but the blade of his dagger was shaking as it drew closer to the man's skin.
Dig away.
Rune mumbled and clenched his jaw tightly. The muscled body quivered under the touch of the blade. How strange it was that one had to cause more hurt before the present pain could be alleviated. There was a sharp intake of breath as the blade reached into the wound to lift away the barbed head. Millen stepped up to take hold of the shaft. Gently at first, then quickly they lifted the arrow free. Blood billowed out after it. Tyro stepped up to take hold of one arm. Millen took hold of the other. Gareth pulled back a little to allow their guide enough room for the cauterizing. He clenched his teeth also as the hot metal seared the open wound. Rune had turned pale. His eyes were closed and he was trembling with the strain. Millen passed the warm water and the rags he had torn to Gareth. Carefully the boy wiped away the blood, pressing down at last to stop the flow. Leaving a clean, dry rag in place, he passed a strip of cloth under the man's chest and under again, pulling it tighter each time, now to split the end and tie it in place. A droplet fell on the back of his hand. He glanced upwards, but there were no clouds in sight. Quickly, he brought up his elbow to wipe his eyes. Once Rune was relatively comfortable, lying on his stomach next to the fire, the heavy mood lifted. There was even some jesting. Tyro placed a hand on Gareth's shoulder.
I wondered who was going to faint first, the patient or the doctor.
He ruffled the boy's hair.
Well done in the end, though.
Rune joined in weakly before long, and all traces of ill feeling disappeared. There was much tension the next day. It was difficult going through the trackless marshland, for Eyre insisted now on keeping far from any settlement or farmstead. They had little to eat, and Rune struggled with a constant jostling. He was short-tempered and rude, especially towards those who were concerned about his comfort. The display of weakness the night before had embarrassed him a great deal, and he was unreasonably angry now with those who had witnessed it. Gareth especially bore the brunt of his ire, and finally dropped back to bring up the rear in sullen silence. There he trudged with drooping head, busying himself with his own pain, inwardly and outwardly. All in all, they were ready for the good news Eyre gave them that evening. Shirvan was within reach, barely a day's brisk walking away to the north. The party munched their meager fare without complaint, spreading out their blankets as far away from Rune as possible without giving offense. Tomorrow they would receive proper care and sleep in proper beds with a proper meal to digest. Someone had to check on the wound, though, and the task fell on the reluctant Gareth. In silence he endured the choice insults the disagreeable man offered as reward for his service. But he drew up the blanket and carefully tucked it round the bare shoulders of his patient. Then he retrieved his own and spread it right next to Rune's on the ground. When he pulled off his shirt, the man could see the markings of his earlier ordeal still swollen and angry, where the raw had ripped the flesh over his ribs. Gareth wriggled into his nightshirt with care, pulled off his boots, and settled down on his stomach. He smiled into Rune's frowning eyes.
Are you in pain?
Yes. And you?
Yes, a little.
Good.
Gareth laughed. Strangely, he thought of Queer, and all the wisdom dispensed so liberally in the Belruth Castle kitchen.
Pain shared is pain halved.
He whispered, and turned away into the warm embrace of his blanket.
First thing I want is an alehouse and a barrel all to myself.
Night had fallen without much warning, as was common for the region during Rhymesong. The party had achieved their goal, though, and was marching through the gates of Sherwin, almost as they were closing for the night. Footsore and famished, their thoughts were centered on finding a place of warmth and comfort, where the difficulties of the passage through the swamps of Fenvale could be most speedily forgotten. Rune was as good as his word. As soon as they were seated under the curious glances of the Vadran customers in an inn aptly named the Greenwater, he ordered and consumed cup after cup of wine, till the landlord brought a tall pitcher and left it on their table. The three men paid him no attention, being far too busy consuming the spicy hot stew, dished up for them in liberal quantities. But Gareth stared at him in fascination. He had seen this annoying behavior before. When Rune almost overturned the pitcher in an attempt to refill his cup, splashing wine over the table and onto the floor, he could not keep from expressing his disgust.
Oh no.
Rune glanced at him.
Oh no, what?
The boy was staring at him again in that weird way.
You are a drinker.
Rune shrugged and deliberately emptied half the cup in a single gulp. Gareth made a face.
Why do you drink so much?
Because I'm so thirsty. Because drinking improves your mood. Because Myrtle is not such a sorry place, and the people such rotten swine. And maybe, if I drink long enough, I won't hear your squeaky little voice anymore.
The boy ignored the sarcastic comments.
If drinking improves your mood, why are you so bad-tempered?
He had to evade the empty wooden bowl Rune threw at him. Smiling, Gareth retrieved it off the floor and ladled a small quantity of food into it. Then he placed it in front of the furious man.
At least eat a little something with it. And later when you empty yourself out, you can think it was not for nothing.
Rune did not consider this baiting comment worthy of a reply. He was doing his best to surrender to the lulling effects of the drink. Even the constant ache in his shoulder was fading rapidly. He would not allow the little squirt to spoil it for him now. Ignoring the bowl, he rose to his feet, turned away and set off a little unsteadily in the direction of the washroom. Millen set off after him, rolling his eyes to the others.
Better make sure he doesn't drown.
Cairo winked at Gareth, who sighed, and dug his spoon into the cooling stew in front of him. Why was it that he had to be burdened with another stubborn drunk man? Perhaps one would eventually get used to it. The royal palace in Sherwin was an imposing sight. Domed towers of various sizes shone white in the morning sun, where they rose above a crenellated wall of seasoned stone. Seated on the highest point of the hill that supported the entire city, it appeared to preside in elegant lordship over the daily drama of Sherwin, from the dwelling of the lowliest thrall to the domicile of the richest merchant. It reminded the men from Heron Inrath a little of Fur and its stony, vigilant guardianship over the Witch Isle. Inside the palace was as organized as its counterpart in the inland sea. No one loitered about or gossiped in untended corners. The courtyards were swept and clean. Not a broken cart or abandoned crate littered the alleyways. A strong hand had control of the Vadran kingdom. Javia received them in the throne room, as she would have formal ambassadors from afar. A herald announced them in the proper manner, causing them to feel acutely embarrassed in their scruffy, trail-worn clothing. The regent of Fenvale, seated on the queen's throne, paid their appearance no heed. Next to her, on the slightly raised and larger throne of the king, sat a 10-year-old Vadran boy, Peric, the future king, with intense dark eyes and close-cropped dark hair. He was quick and intelligent, the pride of his aunt and guardian. Javia's voice cut through the extended welcome of the herald.
Approach, Prince Rune. We have greatly anticipated your arrival these past days. I am dismayed to hear of your ordeal in the marshland. It will not surprise you to learn that Fenvale is already under a siege of swords.
Rune quickly swallowed his ill humor, brought on by the ache in his temples and the stiff, painful shoulder. His voice was gracious, if formal.
I am privileged to enter your reputable realm for the first time, even if it pains me to bring you ill tidings.
Javia inclined her head at him and rose from her seat. She waved the herald out. Motioning the party to a table in the center of the room, she descended the few steps with the boy at her side. She had a determined air about her.
We will take counsel here, before time will allow us any hospitality. I trust you will find it possible to forgive us.
She sat down at the head of the table, and the others followed suit. Her sharp eyes turned to Gareth. He felt a little pressure and smiled at her. There was no returning smile.
Prince Rune, I know you are not yet an ally in our cause, and I shall not attempt to make one of you today. What I tell you here are the simple facts. You may communicate them as such to Lord Karth. There are bands of foreigners scouring the Vale for lone travelers, merchants falling behind their comrades, solitary herders or fishermen. They are taken alive, for no bodies are found. There is no demand for ransom. The goods are seldom spoiled, the flocks never scattered. This has been since the Suntide, building up during Rhyme Song, and now, suddenly, it has almost come to a stop. Tell me, with your newly acquired knowledge, where do you think these unfortunates are taken?
He shrugged, not liking her tone.
You would know better than I, Lady Javia.
Indeed.
She looked at him with undisguised scorn.
But you are not curious? As a man of independent thought and a strong instinct for survival, you certainly take an interest in events unfolding around you. Or are you one who merely waits for the most opportune wind to set your sails accordingly?
She raised a wrinkled hand to her chin.
Do you think they are dragged off to the almost deserted marketplaces of Lakeside and Jewel? Or would they be carted to the Southland to feed the appetite of the consumer? Perhaps he has developed a palate for powerless creatures now that he has tasted the broken boy in the Belruth Hills.
Gareth drew in his breath sharply. He glanced at Rune. The Viron had lowered his eyebrows. He glared at Javia with severe dislike. She addressed him again, this time in low tones.
Take care what you think in my house, Prince.
Rune started to his feet, the chair skidding away and overturning behind him.
I will not play your game, witch. Unlike yours, my thoughts are open for all to scrutinize, and you do not have to delve around in my mind to learn what they are. I will speak them to you plainly.
At last a smile appeared on the crafty old lady's face.
If you will retrieve your chair, we can begin our discussion then.
Millen offered his seat to Rune and went to pick up the discarded chair. The Viron sat down angrily. Another manipulative freak. No wonder Malik had them so worried. They were already halfway round the bend.
They are dragged off to be fed to his swarm. He's about to unleash his darkening tide, to overrun the land from Lysan to the northern forest, destroying everything in his way. In 10 days' time, we will break all the remaining barriers in our land and flood the lowlands with the waters of the inland sea. We will place our guards at the borders to set the pits on fire and light up the tryst wood, or there will be left of the Vadran of Fenvale not even a memory. We have done this before, 600 cycles ago, to stop the scourge that nearly toppled the mighty Kale. And before that, many times. Even if Viron and Ligerium have forgotten the swarm and abandoned their defenses, we will make our stand here as we have always done.
If you have such intelligence, why do you not warn these unprepared neighbors of yours?
Rune asked. Javia shook her head at him.
What world do you live in, Prince? When last has an ambassador from either nation entered our cursed realm? We who will not forsake the art, are we not vilified and avoided as much as possible? They have their cleansing now, and we are twisted and evil in their eyes.
Why does it bother you that they are destroyed then? Would Myrtle not be a better place for it?
Javia looked perturbed for the first time.
You are speaking of your own people.
They are not my people. Even if I did not make that choice, they made it for me. Malik can grind them to dust.
Javia regarded him sadly.
Your bitterness has blinded you to what the result of such an act would be. What do you suppose the inland sea would become when Malik has control of all its shores? His retribution will never cease. His anger never be appeased. Even though he has sworn to destroy every last child of Imran, he will find it hard to do so, for it will end the suffering he can inflict on them. The thirst for vengeance has almost consumed you. Of Malik the Undying there is nothing left but that insatiable desire, and there is no pit into which he will not fall in order to achieve its goal. But you are here to tell me of the dark threat that waits in the wake of his swarm, are you not?
Rune looked at her for a long time before speaking again.
If things are as dark as you surmise, there is little part for me to play in it, except for coming here to add to your burdens.
He gave her the account as he had done in Fur and Aran Rock, and as at those occasions, he was believed almost without reserve. She had questions, though, that were very different to the ones that had been asked before.
You believe this beast intelligent. It was not merely hunting to feed itself.
He considered this carefully.
If it was hunting, it would surely have sensed Millen and me. We were much closer to it, and much easier prey than the fellow in the tree. It was waiting for him, to prevent his escape. That's what I believe now.
It was therefore in control of its faculties, like a man would be, not a brute.
Yes,
There was something disconcerting about the suggestion, but he knew it was true.
I believe so.
And do you believe there could be more of these creatures?
He shrugged.
That I could not say. It is entirely possible, but I saw no evidence to suggest that there are. There was no sign of such things at Xerox.
A dark memory of the caverns under the city of Lakeside stirred, but he brushed it aside. Javia seemed lost in thought for a moment. When she spoke again, she seemed to choose her words with care.
The Vadran of Fenvale, and our strange cousins in the Hand, have not lost our history as have the Viron. Much of what you would condemn by instinct as sorcery, or the infamous art, is remembered and respected here.
She raised her brows at him.
Are you familiar with the history of Fenwith?
Rune shook his head, but Gareth sat up and stared at her. A slight smile formed round her mouth.
I did not expect you to. The Nurians suffer greatly from amnesia, I am told, but not all, it seems.
She winked at Gareth.
Perhaps you should ask the young prince to relate the tale to you, even if the many references to the art would make you uncomfortable. We cannot deny our history, and without Fenwith, there would be no Viron history to speak of.
Rune shifted impatiently.
I do not have much use for old tales.
Javia regarded him with mock surprise.
Did you not also come here to find out how one can defeat such a beast?
She turned to Gareth.
Please, now would be a good time to lift a little of the curtain for this man.
Rune listened intently, though he was determined not to take an interest. Let the witches and their broods sit around swapping stories of the evil days of yore. He would not be taken in by it. He was surprised to find out that a blade slew Malik's monster in the end. A blade's magic he could appreciate, but the one Fenwith supposedly wielded on that day seemed more potent than those of his fellows, or any subsequent Viron weapon. Javia made no further effort at persuasion. She did not even comment when Gareth had completed the telling. It seemed that she had lost interest for the moment. The group was invited to share the midday meal with her, which was a pleasant enough affair, with musicians and acrobats entertaining the guests. Rune managed to arrange for a consignment of bows to be sent to Byrand in Gilrath. Javia seemed more than happy to oblige. Fenvale's allies were few. They returned to their inn that afternoon with mixed feelings. All four thought the regent a rather strange and not particularly friendly person. The boy prince had not spoken a word, but kept staring at the visitors in the most disconcerting way. It was impossible to tell what he had thought of them. It was a relief to be out from under the scrutiny of those two. Rune avoided Gareth for the remainder of the day. The whole Fenwith episode was a bit of a mystery to him. If the old dame had meant it to be enlightening, she was sorely mistaken. Was it the actual blade in question that would slay the beast, or the way in which it had been wielded? And what was the calling on a god part good for? As for armor to keep out the dragon's fire, he had never heard of it. The monster he had seen could not be slain with a fairy tale. The party discussed their plans round the table that evening. As far as Rune was concerned, there was no more to do in Shirvan. The regent had been warned. She believed the warning and would take what steps she could. All that remained now was to get back to Heron Inrath in one piece. That meant he had to follow an easier route than the one that had brought them here.
We will not risk going through the swamps again. They know we are here. War or no war, we will head up the coast to wait for Karth's ship in the Tristwood.
Millen nodded in agreement, but Tyro looked at him in puzzlement.
Provided we can get a message to the captain to meet us there.
Rune scratched his chin. Damn the Vadran for not being a seafaring race. Gareth spoke up, almost at his elbow, giving him a start.
If the ship has not left Aaron Inrath yet, Lord Karth can send it to the Tristwood shore instead.
Rune frowned at him.
And how will he know?
The boy shrugged and said timidly.
I can ask him.
Rune drew away from him a little.
You can speak to him from here.
Other talents, the old man had said. Aethera's son, the old man had said. He remembered the Viron listener in Breck. His flesh crawled. It would take them 2 days to work their way to the new rendezvous. Karth had no objection, but warned them that the ship would take at least 4 days, and could well be late depending on the weather. The Tristwood coast was uncomfortably close to Kilvest in Track's Isles, and his captain would have to give it a wide berth. This arrangement left them with 2 more days to be spent in Fenvale. It suited Gareth well, for now he would have ample time to poke around the bookery of Sherban, hunting for any reference to the first blade of all, the dragon slayer of Fenwith. It also suited Rune well, for the arrow wound troubled him still, and he would have ample opportunity to rest, shouting at the Vadran physicians in between bouts of drinking their quite palatable wine. The waiting at the coast lengthened into 2 days. With little to do, everyone became restless and a little edgy. Having to take Gareth's word for the arrangement, Rune pestered the boy with constant questions, uncertainty gnawing at him. The art was not to be trusted, even by those who practiced it. By the evening of the 2nd day they had both had enough. Rune demanded an assurance more substantial than the young boy's supposition. Gareth tried to convince him that the ship would arrive in the morning. Rune looked up at the sky.
And how would you know this?
The boy sighed in exasperation.
Caleb said.
Gareth stopped abruptly at the other's change of expression.
Kale. You mean Karth?
Gareth was too shocked that he slipped to recover the situation. If he could but shrug and correct the error, nothing would be amiss. But he hesitated, his mouth still half open, his eyes wide. How could he have said it? Even if he had substituted Karth for Kale in his thoughts, when he had learned the truth, everyone called the master of Heron Inrath by his new adopted name. How many even knew who he really was? Besides, Kale the Summoner did not matter any more, did he? He was dead, part of a buried crime of long before, wasn't he? Rune did not pursue the matter. The boy's sudden silence was a sure enough admission. Yet the newly acquired knowledge challenged belief. The old man of the Witch Isle was the monstrous perpetrator of the summoning. If he considered it, there was much sense in such a revelation. The scheming against Malik, the covert nature of his dealings with Nuria. He smiled to himself, wondering whether Byrand and Gary knew the real identity of their close and trustworthy ally. The stars leaned down on them in all their rhyme-song splendor. Gareth stared at them in utter dejection. He was worn out in mind and body. Certainly he enjoyed adventures far more when he read about them in books. Then he could not be the one making the crucial mistakes. There was always a battle round the truth. One did not have enough of it, and had to search constantly. Then one had too much, and had to hide it from others. He sighed and turned onto his stomach. The gashes on his back still smarted, but he hardly noticed them. He turned his thoughts towards Karth, uncertainly, half afraid he would be successful. He imagined Fir, its large stone walls the color of ashes. He trod across the courtyard with its swans, a sad feeling settling over him. At last he found the passage to Karth's door. The rug in front of the fire waited.
I have betrayed you.
Karth was there, his strength and firm resolve as comforting as the solid ground of Myrol beneath the boy. The old man waited for him to explain. Betrayal? What could he mean?
Lord Rune. He knows about you. That you are Kale the Summoner.
How?
I said something. It just slipped out. It was an accident.
Strangely, Karth seemed unconcerned. He was bound to discover it sooner or later. It matters not. But it did matter, and Gareth knew it. He pressed his hands to his temples, stifling a sob rising in his chest. Regret. Its slow poison endured through countless cycles, adding its bitter subtlety to every joy, every imagined pleasure. It wore away the foundations of one's being, till the soul was imprisoned in a dark cavern of melancholy. If only there was a way back, an impossible opportunity to redeem the time, to choose differently. She was sad, so sad, locked up like his mother in eternal regret, robbed in a moment of weakness of fragile happiness. Her days rolled away in languid, fruitless contemplation. Her nights were shallow seas of longing, with no harbor light to reach. Her sighing was the restless wind, with no purpose but to bend the dune grasses in their never-ending dance, till they withered at her touch and retreated back to the dust. But there was no escape, no way to make amends, no atonement for her crime. Every step she took, every relentless hour she kept her course, the miles lengthened, the ages of Myril multiplied, between her great sorrow and the moment of transgression. Gareth watched her unheeded tears, her unseeing eyes fixed on memories and the lingering echo of feelings no longer valid. She had so much to give, a flowering tree in Genesis, placed in the garden of her desire, now withered and wandering, heaping up offense to drown her guilt, a slow suffocation of spirit, till the spiral of terrible fate had dragged her down to utter condemnation. Perhaps he could go to her. If he could touch her, she would not be quite so sad. A sound, a resonant thought, almost forgotten, a small evocative pulse of feeling, laughter, heard only once, a tiny warm body in her arms, and she thought it was worth it, even if the child was a pathetic attempt to hide her shame. He was living proof of their union, a glimpse of redemption. How could it be that she sensed him still through the mists of bitter time? Pelia, the faithless wife, Elena, the witch queen of the Shadow Lord, turned from her dark meditations to look about her once more. Slipping away so quickly, but still discernible among the nebulae of her airy prison, moved a small figure. She remembered. Her name was Namara, and the boy was her gift. Even as the dream faded, the dull, hollow ache intensified, till Gareth had to swallow hard to keep control of his emotions. What a sad place was Myril. Sorrow washed its shores and stirred its leaves. How could one ever begin to mend such misery? He pulled the blanket closer about him against the chill, and shifted a little closer to the fire. Soon he descended once more into the depths of what he hoped would be dreamless sleep. Rune woke to the sound of low voices, deep in conversation. It seemed that he was not the only one having trouble sleeping this night. For a while he lay still, trying to banish the memories of dream from his thoughts. It was a simple nightmare, that was all, even if it seemed so real. The fluttering of wings in the dark dome of the Belruth Temple, probably brought on by their encounter with the Ra in Fenvale. And that woman again, Athera, standing by the gateway in the ruins, speaking words stolen from his mind. Why would she haunt his dreams again after so long? Had he not locked her from his thoughts? Was it the child so close to him here in the forest? But she had visited him before this, before. Would he never be rid of her? Had it not ended with the pain he had seen in her eyes, that day he had cursed her memory and called her a faithless whore? The voices droned on. Tyro had joined Millen in his watch. The men sat close to the fire, speaking under their breath. He strained his ears, resisting the urge to turn over. Tyro was speaking in his deliberate, pensive way.
That is certainly not the natural thing.
Millen's voice, sounding from only 5 yards away, was clear and incredulous.
But why does he treat him so? What harm has the boy done to him? Even with the arrowhead.
Tyro feigned surprise.
You don't see it then.
He was readying himself to dispense wisdom.
See what?
You don't know why he is so hard on the boy.
There was a rustle of fabric as Millen shrugged his cloaked shoulders in exasperation. Rune felt the same way as he recognized Tyro's favorite and most annoying trick. At the same time, he was intrigued by the topic of conversation. Were they speaking about him? Was the boy to whom they referred Gareth? It could very well be. Tyro, having stretched the moment of suspense to its utmost, continued.
You have heard the stories of his betrothed. You have heard that she had betrayed him.
Rune felt the prickles run along his spine. Now he was fully alert. He forced his breath to remain low and regular. Millen this time was also in the know.
I've heard more than that. There is another side to it, I believe.
Yes, and so you will know that there could be doubt in his mind. So when a man is wronged, he tends to believe whatever seems worst to him.
He paused, as if this explanation clarified the whole matter. Millen cleared his throat impatiently, half forgetting to keep his voice low. The older man sighed. Once again he would have to explain the obvious.
This boy is Aethera's son.
Rune's blood stirred at the mention of her name. How could they speak it so casually, as if they had known her, as if they were familiar with the soft poison of her smile, the wild contentment flowing at the sound of her voice? Millen interrupted.
He is also Fengor's son.
Yes, he is. But Lord Rune is not a fool. If the boy had been the son of Loren himself, there would be a fair judgment. One cannot blame the son for the sins of his father, after all. Fengor and Rune came from the same tree.
He paused and leaned in a bit.
No. What is of import here is that he is Aethera's son. And if he stands the pressure and is true, then mayhap she was too.
You mean it is some kind of trial?
There was a scoffing undertone in Millen's whisper.
Exactly. He wants to find a quality in this boy that he believes the mother lacked. In a way, it will prove that he misjudged her. And I think he wants that more than anything.
A long pause followed. Rune was sorely tempted to sit up and tell the man what such nonsensical gossip would earn him, when Millen concluded the matter in a far more mature way than what he would have thought him capable.
No, I cannot see that. I believe he despises him merely for the memory of his brother's treachery, and most of Heron Inrath believes it with me.
During the voyage back to Karth's Isle, Rune and his companions had very little to say to each other. Gareth seemed locked in his own morose thoughts, hardly giving the others the time of day. Rune preferred it like that. Let Millen and the rest believe what they wanted. Perhaps they were right. Fengor would always stand between him and the boy. Nothing could change that. Besides, the boy was a liar like Kale. He was in on the old man's scheming, keeping their secrets, manipulating him to some sinister end. Tyro and Millen seemed to catch the prevailing mood from the other two, and spoke only to each other in low tones. Rune was reminded of the gossip around the fire and ignored them. He spent most of his time in his bunk, using the injured shoulder as an excuse. There was not nearly enough wine on board the vessel to keep away the dark contemplations. Strange thoughts had entered his mind, like the confused intertwining images brought on by delirium. He would not resist them. Why should he side with the summoner when he was so clearly the weaker of the two? Would not Malik be able to give him his revenge? Both of them wanted Fengor destroyed, and Malik's supposed Nurian annihilation scheme might just be a ploy from Kale to keep Rune from siding with the Marsh Lord. He had seen no actual evidence that Malik controlled the swarm. For that matter, he did not even know if the assassins in the marshes had indeed been Malik's men. It was a relief to disembark at Angen and escape to his quarters in the fortress. Garth gave no sign that he was aware of Rune's newly acquired knowledge. Perhaps the boy had been too ashamed to tell him. There was more tension than usual, though. The old man seemed as preoccupied as Rune was. After politely inquiring about his wounded shoulder, Garth went straight to the details of the next mission. Rune was only half listening, biding his time. He had little intention of continuing their partnership. Monborg was the next target. Once more, he would have to drag the boy with him. At least he would have Tyro and Millen again, though not all the time, it seemed. They would spend a 10-day in the city of Vice, waiting for Karth's Southland spies to deliver their final reports, dispatching it with all haste to Heron Inrath. Karth's voice spoke on and on. You will send Millen back to me as soon as you have tidings from Hunnick.
Why don't you merely pry your tidings from my mind? Would it not be quicker?
Garth did not miss the sarcasm in Rune's tone, but would not be baited. Instead, he looked at the other in mock surprise. You would allow this? Rune snorted disdainfully and looked away. The old man did not miss a beat. Tyro will leave as soon as you have evaluated the military build-up, if any, in Monborg. Keep the boy with you and stay out of sight till you receive new instructions from me. It may well be that you will have to return here in haste. If you hear nothing from me, leave Monborg before the darkening. That is very important. He looked sternly at the unresponsive man. You will not forget this. Rune sighed to himself.
Before the darkening, yes.
The words burned on his tongue. Now he should speak them. Now was the time to break with Kale and go his own way. He opened his mouth. The old man was first to speak. Hold the doubts you have one last time. There will not be a mission after this, I promise you. Then a little patience will bring you the prize I have promised. It could not be true. Rune knew it, and yet he hesitated. Why he had not enough conviction to send the old man on his way, he could not comprehend. Still, instead of letting the words flow from him, he shut his mouth in indecision, drawing the semi-permanent frown back in place on his brow.